It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today with you all in fabulous Elkhart, Indiana. It kind of feels like home. My parents were raised in Sturgis, Michigan, so we often come down to Elkhart mainly for shopping. To be honest, that's why we come to Elkhart. So, Anne has asked me to talk to you guys today about restorative justice, my work at Restorative Encounters, and some of the things she's asked me to talk about, I could talk to you for a few days on. So what you are going to get this morning or this afternoon is what I'm calling a sample platter. So it's going to be a lot of information in small chunks. I will try not to overwhelm you. And if you have questions, I will be around the rest of the afternoon, so feel free to grab me. I also have business cards, so you can contact me later. So like Anne said, my name is Barbie Fischer. I fell into this work. It was something that I didn't expect. It's not something I sought out. It was something that, growing up as a kid in the inner city, I actually didn't really care for foreign missions because I saw that there was enough trouble in my own backyard. But God said, too bad, you're going overseas. And I wound up in northern Uganda during the reign of the Lord's Resistance Army in the late 90s, early 2000s. I am not that old. I was still a kid when I was there. But what I learned about when I was there is the Acholi people of northern Uganda have a very specific way of dealing with hurt and harm. And it is through something that we as Westerners have termed restorative justice. So what we are going to talk about today is not a program, it's not a philosophy, it's not a theory. It is actually a way of life. It is a way of being in the world, it is a way of doing life with others that is based off of indigenous practices from around the globe. In our Western context, here in the United States, as well as in Canada, most of what we know as restorative justice is actually largely based off of the Maori people of New Zealand, the indigenous folks of New Zealand. So I need to pay homage to those that have gone before me. This is their work, this is their way of life, and it is with honor and humble privilege that I get to be able to talk about it with you guys today. So before we go too far into things, I need to talk to you about language. So there's this word that we always talk about, but I wonder if we know what it means. And that's the word justice. So generally I would do an exercise we call a Wordstorm, and this was created by a group of men at SCI Greater Ford, which is State Correctional Institute Greater Ford in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. It's like a brainstorm, but it's actually kind of a word association. We would generally put up on a board the word justice and have you tell me what's the first thing that comes to mind. We don't have a lot of time today. So I just want you to tell me, when you think of the word justice, when you see the word justice, what comes to mind for those of you here in the room? And for those of you in Newton, think about this for yourselves. Maybe holler some things out with each other, or go ahead and put them in the chat box in the Zoom as well. So justice, what comes to mind?
Making things right.
Making things right.
The courts.
Courts. Shalom. Punishment. Grace. Fairness. Hope. Anything else?
Criminal versus justice a lot these days.
Criminal?
Criminal justice.
Criminal justice. Jail, yep. Struggle. Thinking about these words, what does this tell us about our concept of justice? Where does our concept of justice come from? Legal system. What else do you notice about these words, though? We've got punishment, but then we've also got fairness and shalom. And hope. Some of these are contradictory, no?
Yeah.
So there's this contradiction that happens when we think about justice. In the English language, we have a rule that you cannot use a word to define itself. Have any of you ever looked at Webster's dictionary for the definition of justice? The maintenance or administration of what is just, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards or punishment. The quality of being just, impartial or fair. The principle or ideal of just dealings or right actions. Does that give you a better understanding of what justice is? So the interesting thing about that then is, what's the definition of just? So justice and just are not very easy to define. Just actually is the idea of being a moral action. But who defines what's morally right? In our society, we have a criminal legal system that defines what's right, what's morally right, what's morally just. Restorative justice, though, is a pathway of personal and societal healing based off of indigenous practices focused on taking responsibility and repairing harm to the extent possible. It's about making things right to the extent possible. That's a tricky thing to think about or to talk about, because in actuality, when someone's convicted of murder, there's no making that right. And that's why when we talk about restorative justice, we talk about the extent possible. Because you can't bring someone back to the dead unless you're Jesus and Lazarus. So now that we've kind of understood, I want to talk a little bit more about criminal versus restorative. So our criminal legal system, because it's not justice, talks about what law has been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve. And I love doing this with lawyers, because they're all like, oh yeah, no, that's pretty much what we do. Yep, Restorative justice, on the other hand, says who has been hurt, what are their needs, and who's obligated to meet those needs. What do you notice about these two sets of questions?
One deals with laws and one deals with people.
One deals with laws, one deals with people.
One seems to deal with victims and one deals with offenders.
One deals more with offenders, one deals more with victims.
Criminal really narrows the focus and restorative broadens the focus.
So the criminal is narrowly focused. Restorative is a broader focus.
Restorative is looking at resolution.
Restorative looks at resolution. So there was this great research team that was looking at a scaled up indigenous practice called gacaca. Gacaca means grassy place in Rwanda. So following the Rwandan genocides, most of the judges had been exiled or killed, and the prisons were overrun. So they didn't have a way, their criminal legal system didn't operate, it didn't work. And so they decided to scale up an indigenous practice called gacaca. Gacaca basically was this idea that when someone committed an offense in the community, everyone would meet on a grassy plain and they would have a conversation. And together they would decide what would happen. What were the needs that were created? Who's obligated to meet those needs, and how are we going to meet those needs? So they scaled up this gacaca and they called it the gacaca courts. At the same time, the International Criminal Court was happening in a foreign country to deal with the human rights violations with some of the worst offenders. So these researchers were going around observing the gacaca courts and asking people, what is justice? What does justice mean for you? And the fascinating thing was that they rarely got the same answer. For one person, it was seeing their home rebuilt. For another person, it was seeing the children back in school. For some, it was vengeance. And I'll touch briefly on that. Yes, that is a normal response when someone has hurt you severely. That is a typical response. I see it every day. However, underneath that response is a deeper need, and that need is for someone to feel their pain. So when we work with clients who have suffered severe harm and their immediate reaction is vengeance or revenge, usually when we can work with them through that and they feel heard, that vengeance and that need for revenge diminishes once they have felt that someone has felt their pain or that they've been heard. But no one really said the same thing for justice. So justice meant different things to different people. You can read more about their research in My Neighbor, My Enemy. It's a great book. They don't just talk about the Gacaca courts, but they also talk about some of the wars in Yugoslavia. So here we have the criminal legal system, and the criminal legal system was really focused on crime as a violation of law and state. So there's a very clear line, a very direct line. Violations create guilt. Justice requires the state to determine blame and impose punishment. So the central focus is really what law has been broken and offenders getting what they deserve. The interesting thing that not a lot of folks know is that there's actually something that we call mandatory sentences. So judges actually do not have the right to give a sentence based off of the circumstances of a case. This is what we saw with juvenile lifers, which has been popular in the news the last couple of years. Juvenile life without parole, meaning you will die in prison, is a mandatory sentence in most states for what is considered a murder 1 or murder 2 crime. Just to clarify, murder 2, you do not actually have to kill anyone. It is merely the fact that someone has died in the midst of another federal offense. So, for example, one of my clients was the getaway driver in a robbery. He had no idea that his partner, who went into the store to rob the store, killed the store clerk. My client was just in the car. He never pulled a trigger, he never killed anyone. He was sentenced to die in prison for murder 2 because the judge had no other choice. That's what our legal system does. Restorative justice, on the other hand, says crime is a violation of people and obligations. We are connected. Violations create obligations, and so justice involves victims, offenders, and community members in an effort to put things right. So the victims, the people who are mostly impacted by the crime or the offense, they get to say, what is it that's going to help me heal? What is it that I want to see happen? The central focus is really the victim's needs and the offender's responsibility to repair harms. There was recently a case in the news in Texas, just this past week. A father, both his wife and one of his 2 sons were murdered. They were murdered by his other son. His son was sentenced to die. And this father said, killing my other son will do more harm to me than what he has already done to me. So the state has said the appropriate punishment is for this young man to die because he took 2 lives. But the father, the one survivor, says no. That's actually going to cause me more harm than what he's done to me. And for the first time, the parole board in Texas unanimously said, we're going to listen to the victim. And we're going to recommend that this man's sentence be commuted to life instead of death. And the governor listened as well. For the first time in his 4 years in office, the governor of Texas commuted someone's sentence from death to life behind bars. Not really a better alternative because it still means he's going to die in prison, but at least he has a chance at redemption, a chance to learn, a chance to be alive. The important thing to know about restorative justice is, like I said, the legal system is very black and white. It's very cut and dry. Restorative justice, it's not a map. It doesn't have clear lines. Instead, the principles of restorative justice can be seen as a compass pointing a direction. And this quote, restorative justice is not a map, but the principles of restorative justice can be seen as a compass pointing a direction, is actually a quote from Howard Zare out of the Little Book for Restorative Justice. Because again, this isn't a philosophy or a program that we're talking about. This is a way of being and doing life. So the core thing that you need to think about when we're talking about restorative justice is actually restorative justice values. What are some of the values that are part of restorative justice and some of the principles? And so I have a nice sheet of paper that you guys can have to take home with you that talk about some of the principles and values of restorative justice. This is an important thing to grasp, because when we're talking about this, one of the big things, and it's kind of far down here on the list, the fifth one, interconnectedness. This is kind of the core of a lot of restorative justice work. The fact that all human beings are uniquely bonded by their shared experience. Everyone is valued and connected to society. Therefore, society mutually shares the responsibility to create and sustain healthy communities. There's a South African phrase called Ubuntu. It means I am because you are. I am because we are. Ubuntu. Have any of you seen the movie Avatar from years ago with the blue people? So I love the scene where they're just looking at each other. And you should go back and watch it. If you haven't seen it, you can Google it and find it. I'm pretty sure it's on Netflix. But there's this scene where they're looking at each other and they realize that they exist because the other exists. And that is the concept of Ubuntu. I would not be here without all of you in this room, nor would you be here without me. We are interconnected. And so there is a ripple effect that happens. Within other cultures and other societies, there is more of a communal feel to them. Here in the US, we have devised this idea that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that we are independent, that we can do it on our own, which is a false sense of security, because that's not how we were created. God said it was not good for man to be alone. We were created and designed to live in community. And that's the core of restorative justice, is we are interconnected. So whether or not you realize it, when someone goes to prison, that impacts you. When someone is harmed because of crime, that impacts you. Whether or not you realize it, it does. One of the basic ways, and this is the way that I usually talk about it, especially when I'm in the suburbs, so you pay taxes, right? Everybody pays taxes. Hopefully you pay taxes, because if not, you're in trouble. So guess how much money your tax dollars go to incarcerate one person every year. So just to house one person in prison in the United States, any guesses? How much does it cost to house one person in prison? $18,000? $80,000? Well, it's somewhere in the middle. $40,000. $40,000 a year for one human being. One human being. $40,000. I used to be a social worker. I made less than that in a year. So that was a little upsetting to me. We have 2.3 million incarcerated people in our country. That's a lot of taxpayer dollars. So whether or not you realize that mass incarceration impacts you, also with mass incarceration, family members are impacted. They lose an income into their household. Mothers and fathers who are left behind, because women are also incarcerated, their children often end up in child welfare. Or if they stay with their parents end up on welfare. That again is your taxpayer dollars at work to pay for these children and their family members because their loved one cannot pay for them themselves because they're in prison. Other cultures, actually Denmark and the Netherlands, have a great setup. You earn a living wage while you're in prison. That way you can continue to support your family while you're in prison. It also sets you up, you have to have a savings account. So when you leave prison, you have money to start your life. Here in the United States, we said in our 13th Amendment, right, that we've banned slavery. Is that correct? Somebody's shaking their head. No. We did with one exception, right? What's the exception? Exactly, except for the punishment of crime. Except for the punishment of crime. Modern day prisons are merely modern day plantations. Except this time it's not just black people, it's also brown and white people who are incarcerated. They make less than 25 cents a day for labor. It also impacts you, and you pay into that. How many of you went to Starbucks today? Nobody. One. Okay, one. Starbucks, JCPenney's, two of the largest buyers into the prison industrial complex. Your Starbucks mug cups, the paper cups from Starbucks, they're made by incarcerated people. The people who makes the paper cups from Starbucks, they make less than 10 cents an hour, 10 cents a day. 10 cents a day to make your paper Starbucks cup. So if you go to Starbucks, I suggest you bring your own cup if you want to continue to go to Starbucks. So those principles and values that I gave you, and Newton, I didn't forget about you. We will make sure that we email them to you. Those are kind of our guiding principles and values for restorative justice. When we're talking about restorative justice, that's what we're looking at, is are these principles, are these values part of the process? The guiding questions, we gave you 3 earlier, but there's actually 5. So not only do we want to talk about who's been hurt, what are their needs, whose obligation are those, but we also want to say who is at stake in this situation, and what is the appropriate process to involve stakeholders in an effort to put things right. Now, we've talked about victims are the ones who are prominently the focus of restorative justice, and yet I'm also talking about mass incarceration, so you guys are probably really confused, but I'm going to get there, I promise. So what I want to note here, though, is that there is a continuum that you see at the bottom of the screen, not restorative to very restorative. Restorative justice is not a program. It is a way of life. So there are things that are going to be more restorative than not. So victim-offender dialogue processes are very restorative practices. You have a victim and offender who are together, who are talking, who are working at healing together. Reentry work, we do a lot of restorative reentry work. That would be farther on the scale to not as restorative because our direct victim of the crime is not involved. But it is still restorative. It is still restorative because we're working at restoring the individual to who they are meant to be, who God created them to be. We're restoring them to their family system, and we're restoring them to the community. But the victim is missing from that process. The direct victim of their crime is missing from that process. So that's why it's not as restorative as possible. However, when you have crimes like drug offenses, a lot of times those crimes people say are victimless crimes. They're not victimless crimes. That massively impacts family, massively impacts their family. So I want to talk a little bit now about healing harm and who actually has been harmed. So justice requires that we work to restore those who have been injured, but who has actually been injured? Judith Herman talks about in her book, Trauma and Recovery, about what trauma actually is, what victimization actually is, and she says, disempowerment and disconnection from others are the core of trauma and victimization. So disempowerment and disconnection creates a victim. So when we think about mass incarceration, disempowerment and disconnection does not just apply to the direct victim of a crime. It also applies to the offender. It also applies to their family members. So a lot of times when you see restorative justice, you'll see 3 circles with a triangle in the middle, and you'll see the community has been impacted. You'll see those who have been harmed, the victim. You'll see the offender. But we at Restorative Encounters have added these two additional circles, the victim's family, the offender's family, because they also have been harmed, deeply, deeply harmed. And they're often forgotten, even by restorative justice practitioners. We in Philadelphia right now are going through a lot of resentencing hearings for juvenile lifers. There were a couple of cases recently, Miller and Montgomery, that were deemed juvenile life without parole as unconstitutional. Pennsylvania has a quarter of juvenile lifers in the entire country. 300 people just from Philadelphia alone. 300 men and women are returning to Philadelphia after spending upwards of 30 and 40 years in prison, and they were incarcerated between the ages of 12 and 16. So we've been having resentencing hearings, and what has struck me at these resentencing hearings is when the family members of those who have died sit in those courtrooms, it's as if 30 years haven't gone by. They are right back to the day it originally happened, because they have not received the healing and the support that they need to move forward. So when we're talking about reentry, when we're talking about mass incarceration, we have to remember that there is a large group of people. Just as much as we have people coming out of prison, we have victims of crime who are still wounded and hurting in our communities, and we cannot forget them while we're doing this work. The same thing is with family members. What folks don't think about is the family that gets left behind. So imagine that you're at home watching television like you usually do on a weekday night to unwind from work, and you're expecting your significant other or your child to come home, and they don't. Your mind is racing. Where are they? Are they dead? Are they in the hospital? If you're lucky, you'll get a phone call. If you're lucky. Sometimes it'll be multiple days before you get a phone call. Hey, Mom and Dad, I'm in jail. You didn't ask for this. And now you've got to bail them out. Thousands upon thousands of dollars just to get them home. We don't even know if they did it yet. Then there's the visits. You are subject to search every time you set foot on a prison or jail. I have been searched numerous times. I have been strip searched. I have never committed a crime. But the minute you set foot onto a prison facility's grounds or a jail's grounds, whether or not you are a volunteer or a family member, you are subject to search. And that includes strip searches. Family members have often reported that they think that the correctional officers make life difficult for them because they don't want them to come visit their families. We actually had a situation. I go up to SCI Greaterford every Thursday, and a couple weeks ago there was a situation where there was a large issue within the facility. And so the facility was on lockdown, so evening visits were on hold. And it rarely happens that they cancel visits, but we were all waiting around, and all of a sudden, one of the sergeants came out and said that visits for the evening were canceled. Mind you, we've all been waiting for at least 2 hours now. And this woman was very, very upset and almost in hysterics. And so myself and one of the other folks that I go in with, we kind of took her aside to talk to her, see what was going on. She had driven 8 hours to come for this visit. She came to see her brother before she got married the next day. Visits were canceled, and she didn't know the next time she'd be able to come up. She hadn't seen her brother in 4 years. Children grow up without parents because of this. So we have to remember the family members. Coming home in stereotypes. 2.3 million people are incarcerated. 2.3 million people. The United States represents about 4.4% of the world's population, right? So we have 4% of the world's population, 4.5 roughly. But we house 22% of the world's prisoners. 4.7 million people are on probation or parole, so they are not free. They are still under the watchful eye of the criminal legal system. That means they are on ankle monitors or have to report to a parole or probation officer on a regular basis. That means the slightest screw up and they will be back in jail or prison. We just had an incident with one of the guys that I work with who is on parole. One of his stipulations is that he cannot interact with other people who have also been incarcerated. Well, that kind of creates an issue when he's receiving services at a reentry organization where other people who are also formerly incarcerated receive services. So his parole officer and I had to have a very heated discussion about how to go about him receiving services and also not violating his parole. 4.7 million are on parole or probation, and yet most of them will wind up in jail again for minor things. Some of them, it is because of simple things like their family members don't understand that they can't have alcohol in the house. I was in jail for a drug offense, and one of my probation requirements is that I can't be around alcohol, and yet my sister and my mom like to have wine every night, and that's who I live with. And so when my probation officer comes by the house and finds wine, it doesn't matter that it's not mine and I'm not drinking it, I wind up back in prison. We were working with the federal pen in West Virginia because they were finding that a lot of their people were returning home and they weren't entirely sure why. They kept saying it was domestic violence. And I was like, well, is it domestic violence or is it something else? Like, let's unpack this. I wouldn't say it was domestic violence. There was actually no physical altercations happening, no real verbal assaults happening. I would call it domestic disputes. What was really happening were these men were coming out of this federal penitentiary and becoming the king of the castle again, having not been home for 15 to 20 years, and their significant others, their wives, were getting mad because they weren't taking out the trash or they weren't helping with the chores. And these women had been wounded because this man abandoned them for 15 to 20 years. And now he comes home and expects her to cook dinner every night and do all the housework, the things she's been doing by herself for so long, and now she wants a break. And so she gets mad and she kicks him out. Well, he has a home plan that says he has to live with her. So he's now violated his home plan and he goes back to prison. So one of the things that we started doing was restorative reentry circles, allowing family members to have a chance to process their own trauma, their own harm. How have you been impacted by your family members' incarceration? And what is it that you want to see from them? And creating behavioral contracts. My clients call me Super Nanny, if any of you remember that show, because we actually have behavioral contracts that we put on the refrigerator. I don't care if you're a grown human being. If you're going to live with someone and you haven't lived with them for over a year, then let's talk about who's responsible for taking out the trash. When does the trash get taken out? Do they have to make their bed every morning? Who's cleaning the bathroom? How often do they have to clean the bathroom? We get down to the nitty-gritty because conflict needs to be avoided, because when there's conflict, that's when you wind up back in prison. 95% of all incarcerated people come home. 95%. How many of you would have guessed that? Lots of no head shaking. Couple maybes. 95% of all incarcerated people come home. So we have to make sure that they can come home well. 54% of incarcerated people have children. Over half of the incarcerated people have kids. And approximately 10 million children in the United States have had a parent that has been incarcerated at some point in their lives. 10 million kids. According to Urban Institute, the experience of a parent going to prison will have a significant impact on the emotional, psychological development, and financial well-being of the child. Children have difficulty visiting their parents and often lose contact. They drop out of school more frequently and are more likely to be incarcerated than their peers. Separation due to a parent's incarceration is often accompanied by stigma, ambiguity, and a lack of compassion and support. Human rights advocates have called parental incarceration the greatest threat to a child's well-being in the United States. Not drugs, not gun violence. A parent's incarceration, the greatest threat to a child's well-being in the US. What are some stereotypes that you guys have about folks coming home? What do you think about people who come home from prison? Assumed that they were ready to come home and live, like you. Yep. Without struggles.
Questions about being at home.
Yep.
Many will go back again.
Many will go back again. Yep. And stereotypes, let's say this, aren't necessarily bad. Stereotypes are there for a reason. They are grounded in some bits of truth. And that is true. Many go back. The recidivism rate, which means you will reoffend in the United States, is close to 70%.
Does that include parole violations or?
Yes.
You know what it is without counting parole violations?
That I do not. I can tell you with restorative justice processes, that number goes below 50. In fact, in California, we have a restorative justice program where their recidivism rate is at 13%. Many of the stereotypes are that they are still violent, that they are a threat, that they are scary. When we are the victim of a crime, we often characterize those who have harmed us as monsters. And so if you were a monster once, you're a monster forever. But the truth is that hurt people hurt people. And that is what I love about restorative justice, because it recognizes that even though I might have caused harm, I myself could have been harmed. I was working with a group of folks in Philly called the Reentry Think Tank. It is a group of returning citizens, which is Philly's term for people coming home from prison. Not all of them like that term. I personally don't like it either, because it's like, what are you returning from? What are you returning to? And we've always been citizens, even though we were in prison. But so these folks were formerly incarcerated and now they're home, and this group has decided that we should speak into how reentry services are done in Philadelphia, because we're the ones that have to go through reentry. So we're the experts, because we're the ones that live it. So let us tell you what we need, which is exactly what restorative justice says. Let those who are most impacted tell us what they need, and let's help them find out how to meet those needs. And we as a society need to help meet those needs. So I was working with them, and we were doing a workshop on what is restorative justice, and we were talking about the idea of responsibility and accountability and making things right. And there was a woman that struck me, a white woman, by the way, another stereotype: most incarcerated people are black. White women is the largest growing population of incarcerated people. Not men, women, and white women. This white woman, well-dressed, from a ritzy town north of Philadelphia, far north of Philadelphia, said, "How do you expect me to make things right and help heal the harm that I have caused when I'm still bleeding?" Her son was killed by a drunk driver in a very wealthy town. The drunk driver didn't get punished at all. No fine, no jail time, absolutely nothing. This mother, in her grief, turned to alcohol herself, and that turned to drug use, and that ultimately wound her up in prison. She went to prison because she was trying to self-medicate the pain of losing her son and watching the person who harmed her get off scot-free. So how can we expect her to make things right when no one's made things right for her and the harm that's been caused to her? That's why I love restorative justice, because we've been able to take a step back and work on her own healing. What does she need to heal with the loss of her son so that she can move forward and not need to self-medicate and start repairing her relationships with her family members and with her community that she's harmed through her drug use and her alcoholism? One of the things with people returning home is they reach several obstacles. Most reentry organizations focus on housing and jobs. A house and a job do nothing when you don't have support and when your family situation is broken. So that's actually where Restorative Encounters focuses our work, is helping people learn how to walk with people through their return home. One of my first clients taught me a lot. His name is Speedy. His nickname is Speedy. Speedy was in prison for 30 years, and when he came home, we got him a cell phone, and he was living with his daughter. And I got a frantic call one day, and I literally could not make out a word that he said. He was just hysterical. And I finally was like, take a couple deep breaths, Speedy, come on, deep breaths. I can't understand what you're saying. And finally he said, Barbie, I don't know which orange juice to buy. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, I'm at the grocery store and I just don't know which orange juice to buy. Do I buy pulp? Do I buy no pulp? Do I buy calcium added? Do I not buy calcium added? Do I buy Tropicana? Do I buy this brand? Do I buy that brand? Which one do I get? The man had been in prison for 30 years. He didn't have to pick orange juice. Next time you go to the grocery store, look at how many options there are. It is overwhelming. One of my buddies, Aki, that I do a lot of events with, he works in restorative justice at SEI Greaterford for us for years, and he came home last year, and we had this conversation because he kept calling me and not leaving me voicemails, and so I didn't know why he was calling, and I kept missing his call, and so I called him back, and we finally connected, and I was like, Aki, what's up? You don't ever leave me a voicemail. And he went, oh, I can do that now. When you're in prison and the voicemail picks up of someone that you call, the prison recording kicks in. You have received a call from State Correctional Institute, Greaterford. The call is from, so you can't leave a message. So instinctively, when the voicemail picks up, he hangs up the phone. He had to retrain his brain. Email was a whole nother thing. Like, he didn't know what the reply button was, because the reply button does not say reply, it's an arrow. And he was like, I don't know. So I was getting new emails every time he needed to say something in response to an email I sent him. And that was a whole nother thing, because first I got emails with no subject, and then I explained what the subject line was, and then I was getting emails that were just in the subject line. But the thing is that he came home to a son and a granddaughter, and they just want to be with him and love on him. They don't want to be teaching him this stuff. That's work. And so luckily, Aki had me and others in his life that could walk him through these things, because no parent should ever have to be taught by their child how to leave a voicemail or how to send an email. Family connections are one of the biggest things. That is the biggest obstacle to reentry. family connections. This is Daiwan. Daiwan is amazing. I love him. Those are his 3 kids. There's also, if you go to Gabriella's website, for time's sake, I won't show it. I might show a clip of it because it's actually fabulous at the end. But Daiwan is wonderful. Daiwan went into prison with 3 children who were very, very young, and he didn't know what it was to be a dad. And he was able to connect with a program called FACT, Fathers and Children Together. FACT allows children to visit their parents without anyone else. They get quality one-on-one time with their parents. A group of volunteers bring the children in. So often the mothers will bring the children to the prison, but the mothers stay up in the visiting room or go elsewhere and have coffee together while the children visit with their parents. Because a lot of times the mothers aren't with the fathers anymore. And so that actually creates a barrier. I'm not with your dad. I don't want to go see him. So that means you don't get to go see him. So FACT allows these kids to have one-on-one time. They do arts and crafts. They had a father-daughter dance. They get pictures with them. That is where he learned how to connect with his kids. So when he came home, he talks about, I knew how to be a 24/7 dad, and I'm a 24/7-hour dad. So he didn't have as much difficulty reconnecting with his kids when he got out because it started when he was in prison. But that's the biggest struggle because these children don't have a relationship with their parents. So when they come home, how do you parent when you haven't been around? How do you reconnect? Or even with siblings or others. So one of the guys that we work with, Phil's mom didn't tell anyone for 12 years that her son was in prison. And then all of a sudden in church one day, she confided in a woman who was sitting next to her. Well, guess what? That woman's son was in jail too. And now they're like best friends, and they carpool to the prison together. For 12 years, she didn't tell anyone that her son was in jail. Thanksgiving, everyone's together. Her son is absent, and nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. She's alone. He has a younger brother. He also doesn't want to talk about it. He hadn't seen his younger brother in 10 years. And then we finally convinced him to go visit. Phil had no control over the relationship with his brother. All he could do was send letters and try to call him. His brother had to make the effort to come up and visit. Subject himself to correctional officers' attitudes and bad moods. They're not all bad. Some of them are in good moods. We joke a lot. I like my correctional officers. He had to subject himself to that to come visit his brother, take time out of his day when his brother in his mind left him. So family connections is the biggest obstacle. So why should we care about this? Why should we do any of this? Why should we worry about people coming home from prison? Because this is what God tells us to do, plain and simple. This is what God talks about when he talks about peace in Scripture. We as Mennonites talk about being a peace church, right? But when we talk about peace, I often think that we've watered it down. We talk about nonviolence. We talk about not being against war. We talk about, not having conflict. But when we talk about peace in Scripture, what we're really talking about is shalom. And shalom is so much deeper than the absence of conflict, the absence of war, the absence of violence. Shalom at its core is about right relationships. It's about right relationships between us and God, within ourselves, between us and our fellow human beings, as well as between us and the rest of creation. So if we as Christians want to truly live out God's shalom, then we need to be working at right relationships with our fellow human beings, which means those people who are in prison, those people coming home from prison, their family members. We need to be working at helping restore them to who God created them to be, helping them have right relationships with their family members. I actually want to go to this one. Righteousness. I love this. So in the English language, we actually miss out a lot in Scripture. So righteousness, the Hebrew and Greek words for justice and righteousness show up over 1,000 times in Scripture. 1,000 times, really more than anything else. Did you know that? So, but this is the interesting thing, is that often in the Hebrew, they're interchangeable. And righteousness, if you think about it, and you actually look at the definition, it's doing, being, or declaring what is right. And they often show up together. Amos says, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an overflowing stream. Or Isaiah 32:11, see, a king will reign in righteousness, but the princes will rule with justice. Righteousness in the Bible incorporates the idea of doing justice, and doing justice in the Bible conveys the idea of righting what has gone wrong. By restoring things to a condition of rightness. Restorative justice is about making things right to the extent possible. Restorative justice is about being righteous. It's about biblical justice. To know shalom requires us to know justice and peace. They're inseparable. The Hebrew word for righteousness, which is a dimension of shalom, results in the Latin version justia, which is the word for justice. Did you catch that? So the Hebrew word for righteousness gets translated into Latin as justice. But the word justice flows from this Latin word is the concept of justice which has evolved into the Western world of the rights of the individual instead of the community. And that's not what God has called us to. Rabbi Robert I. Kahn of Houston, Texas, capsulizes the distinctiveness of the Roman idea of peace, which is more so our Western concept of peace, to what the Hebrew shalom really means. And he says this by saying, one can dictate a peace. Shalom is a mutual agreement. Peace is a temporary pact. Shalom is a permanent agreement. One can make a peace treaty. Shalom is a condition of peace. Peace can be negative, the absence of commotion. Shalom is positive, the presence of serenity. Peace can be partial. Shalom is whole. Peace can be piecemeal. Shalom is complete. So when we think about God's shalom and why we should do this, it's because we as Christians are called that all people are made in the divine image of God. So those monsters that we lock up are created in the image of God. All humanity was created by God. And we are called to seek to live in shalom. Psalms 34:14, seek peace and pursue it. We're called to love for one's fellow human being. You shall not, Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In Mark, we hear that that's one of the greatest commandments. There is a constant interplay of justice and mercy. Probably the most famous, Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And redemption is possible for all of us because we are all sinners and have all fallen short. And so someone who has committed a crime has merely gotten caught for their sin, but they are redeemable, just like every one of us in this room. So I love when people ask me why they should care about people who are in prison. And it's simple, because they're people, just like you and me. That's why when we talk about people who are formerly incarcerated or are currently incarcerated, we try to be careful with our language. Because language is important, because it can often focus on one aspect of who we are rather than the whole. And so in restorative justice, you've heard me use words like victim and offender today. Those are limited words, and they don't capitalize on who the people really are. Because we are complex, and there is more to us than just an offense that has been done to us or an offense we have done. So they are people. We are all people, complex human beings, created in the image of God, and that's why we are called to do this work. The important thing to remember that when you're walking with someone through through returning home, you need to listen to them. What are their needs? And walk with them through those needs. Help them navigate the little things. Remember, they don't know what you know. Technology, buying orange juice, even picking out pants. I have clients that don't know what size they wear because they don't have to buy clothes. Take a step back from what you know and put yourselves in their shoes. For 20 years, I haven't had to think or make a decision. I haven't had to pick my clothes. I haven't been able to pick when I shower, when I get to go outside, what I get to eat. I tell my clients and their family members to limit choices when you first come home. It's not what do you want for breakfast, because I don't know. I haven't had to pick in years. Instead, it's would you like cereal or scrambled eggs? If you have to go shopping, pick a small store. Don't go to the mall. Please don't go to the mall. And remember that they are overwhelmed and overstimulated, and that's okay. Be patient and listen. That's the most important. And with their family members, they need someone to hear that they have also been injured. They have also been harmed. And they are working through their own trauma as well. Help facilitate those conversations. How have you been impacted? And what can your loved one who's coming home do to make that right for you? I had a little girl in one of our circles that said she just wanted her mom to make her cupcakes for her soccer game because she was the only one that didn't have a parent to make snacks, and she really loved her mom's cupcakes. So I guarantee you that first year that mom was home, every time she had snack duty, she made her cupcakes. It's just a matter of listening and being present. That is what we are called to do. Thank you.